You've probably seen the image. A man in his shirt sleeves, caught in the harsh light of a TV studio. He has a phone jammed against one ear, but he's not looking at the camera. He's staring at a piece of paper, a simple bulletin that somehow carries the weight of the entire world. He takes off his thick, black-framed glasses, and for just a second, the mask of the unflappable newsman slips. His voice, that familiar, calming baritone that had guided millions through the Cold War and the space race, suddenly cracks. All the composure is gone, replaced by something raw and unfiltered. This man was Walter Cronkite, a figure so steady he was literally known as the most trusted man in America. So what kind of news could possibly be so big, so earth-shattering, that it could break the unbreakable? What does it take to get a completely unscripted, emotional reaction from a man who was the living definition of reliable, and in doing so, reveal the grieving human being behind the anchor's desk? To really get why that moment hit so hard, you first have to understand the man at the center of it all. Walter Cronkite wasn't just some guy reading the news, he was a fixture in the American home, a constant in a world that felt like it was changing way too fast. He became the anchor of the CBS Evening News in 1962, right when television was becoming the nation's main source of information. Think about it, in 1950, only about 9% of American homes had a TV. By 1960, that number had skyrocketed to 90%. This new medium needed a new kind of guide, someone who could not only read the headlines but also make a chaotic world feel a little more manageable for the millions watching at home. Cronkite was perfect for the job. His credibility wasn't some act put on for the cameras. It was earned the hard way, in the middle of World War II. As a correspondent for United Press, Cronkite was in the thick of it. He covered naval battles in the North Atlantic, flew in bombing raids over Germany, landed with Allied forces in North Africa, and was even there for the D-Day invasion of Normandy. The man wasn't just reading history, he'd seen it up close, and that gave his reporting a quiet authority you just couldn't fake. When he talked about world events, you knew he understood the stakes because he'd been there. After the war, he moved over to the new world of television, bringing that hard-won integrity with him. In the 50s, he hosted a show called You Are There, which reenacted historical events like live news broadcasts, a perfect fit for his talent of making the past feel immediate. He basically helped invent the modern news anchor, becoming a steadying presence during the Cold War. Night after night, as Americans were worrying about nuclear bombs and the Iron Curtain, it was Walter Cronkite who delivered the news with calm professionalism. He became our national guide through the space race, and his genuine, almost boyish excitement for the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions was infectious. His coverage was so tied to the space program that a lot of Americans felt like they were experiencing it right alongside him. He had a knack for explaining complicated stuff with clarity and balance. And while he later admitted he held progressive views, you'd never have known it from his reporting. He was fiercely objective, and that earned him the trust of a public that was sick of political spin. Polls repeatedly named him the most trusted man in America. He wasn't just a reporter, he was Uncle Walter, the reliable voice who showed up in your living room every evening to explain the world. He was a rock. And on November 22, 1963, that rock was about to be shaken to its foundation, live, in front of millions. Friday, November 22, 1963, started out like any other day. The country was in a weird place, an era of simmering tensions but also incredible optimism. The post-war boom was still going strong, but everyone was living under the shadow of the Cold War. The civil rights movement was gathering steam, challenging the way things had always been. And in the White House, there was a sense of youth and energy, an era we now call Camelot. President John F. Kennedy, at just 46, was the first true television president. His charm, his witty press conferences, and his beautiful family had captivated the country. He and his wife, Jacqueline, brought a new kind of glamour to Washington, and they felt like a symbol of a bright, modern future. In fact, Kennedy had helped launch the very first half-hour evening newscast with an interview he gave to Walter Cronkite just a few weeks earlier, on September 2. The two men, both war veterans of the same generation, were linked by the very medium that had made them famous. On this Friday, the president was in Texas to do a little political fence mending before the 1964 election. The day started gray and misty in Dallas, but by mid-morning, the sun had broken through. It seemed like a perfect day for a parade. The presidential motorcade, with the Kennedys and Texas Governor John Connally in an open-top limo, moved slowly through streets packed with cheering crowds. The whole scene was festive, waving hands, smiling faces, pure American optimism, and everywhere else, life was just going on. In New York City, at the CBS Broadcast Center, the newsroom was in its usual midday lull, prepping for the evening news. At 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, most of the TVs tuned to CBS were showing the soap opera, As the World Turns. People were lost in a world of made-up drama, a comfortable daytime escape. All across the country, the ordinary rhythm of a Friday afternoon was playing out. Kids were on buses coming home from school, just like Cronkite's own 13-year-old daughter. People were going about their business, completely unaware that reality was about to deliver a blow more shocking than any work of fiction could ever dream up. The script for the day had been written, but in a flash, it was about to be torn to pieces. The first sign that something was terribly wrong didn't come from a picture. It came from a sound. At the UPI bureau in Dallas, a reporter named Merriman Smith was in the press car, just a few vehicles behind the president. As the motorcade passed the Texas School Book Depository, he heard the sharp crack of a rifle. Being a seasoned reporter, Smith instinctively grabbed the only radio telephone in the car, literally fighting off other reporters to get the first report out. That bulletin, sent over the wire service, is what set off alarms in newsrooms everywhere. Back at CBS News in New York, at around 1:38 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 bells rang from the wire machine, a signal for a major bulletin. The UPI teletype machine clattered out a sparse, terrifying message: 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. An editor ripped the copy from the machine and yelled the news across the room. The newsroom went from calm to what one producer later called organized chaos. The first problem was technical. Back in 1963, TV studios didn't keep cameras warmed up all day. It took several minutes to get one ready. There was no time. Walter Cronkite, who'd been in his office working on the evening script, ran into the newsroom. Still in his shirt and tie, no suit coat, he bolted to a small radio booth to get the news out as fast as he possibly could. At 1:40 p.m., 10 minutes into As the World Turns, the show was cut. TV screens went black, then showed a simple slide that read CBS News Bulletin. Over that slide, a voice came on the air, a voice the whole country knew. It was Walter Cronkite. His delivery was urgent, but still professional. Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the bulletin was over. CBS went back to the soap opera. But you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Normalcy was shattered. The newsroom was now a frenzy of ringing phones and people shouting. Information was coming in, but it was patchy, contradictory, and terrifying. Another bulletin arrived, adding a chilling detail: the wounds for President Kennedy perhaps could be fatal. Minutes later, Cronkite was back on air, this time on camera. The image was stark. He sat at the news desk in his shirt sleeves, the chaos of the newsroom visible behind him, a phone clutched in his hand as he tried to gather information live. He became the calm center of a hurricane of rumor and fear, a filter for the terrifying reports coming out of Dallas. For the next hour, Cronkite and his team worked to piece the story together. They had to be so careful. There were rumors flying that the president was dead, but Cronkite, a man who lived by the rule of verification, refused to report it until it was official. He knew that saying something that monumental, and getting it wrong, was an unforgivable sin for a journalist. He carefully told the audience what was known and what was not known. All the while, the one question that mattered most hung in the air: was the president alive? The entire country, paralyzed with dread, waited with him for an answer. The clock on the wall of the CBS newsroom ticked past 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. For almost an hour, Walter Cronkite had been the anchor of an entire nation's anxiety. He was a bastion of journalistic principle in a sea of chaos. Behind the scenes, the tension was unbearable. A man walked into the newsroom and handed Cronkite a piece of paper. It was the official flash from the Associated Press. The confirmation they had all been dreading. No flourish, just the cold, hard fact. Cronkite, who was in the middle of a sentence, just stopped. He looked down at the copy. The newsroom, which had been buzzing with noise, seemed to fall completely silent. What happened next lasted only a few seconds, but it would become one of the most famous moments in television history. Cronkite, the ultimate professional, did a few small, deliberate things. He reached for his glasses and put them on, as if to make sure he was reading the unthinkable words correctly. He cleared his throat. He looked at the paper, then up into the camera. From Dallas, Texas, he began, his voice steady, the flash, apparently official. He paused, his eyes on the wire copy. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. And then, it happened. The composure he'd held together for an hour finally broke. As Cronkite finished the sentence, his voice, that familiar baritone, cracked. It was a tiny tremor, but it was filled with the weight of the news. He swallowed hard, visibly fighting to keep it together. He took his glasses off again, and his eyes were glistening. He looked away from the camera and up at the clock on the wall, maybe to mark the time, or maybe just to look anywhere else. That he bit his lip, his jaw tight. For a man whose entire career was built on being a stoic messenger, the emotion was right there for everyone to see. In that instant, he stopped being just an anchor. He was one of us. He wasn't the most trusted man in America reading a bulletin anymore. He was a fellow citizen, sharing in a moment of profound, collective grief. He later admitted how hard it was, saying, "I choked up, I really had a little trouble." His own daughter revealed that he thought his display of emotion was unprofessional, a brief lapse in the objective armor he wore so proudly. After a 5-second pause, an eternity on live TV, he put his glasses back on, trying to regain his professional footing. He cleared his throat again, the sound now thick with emotion, and continued. "Vice President Johnson," he said, his voice still shaky, "has left the hospital in Dallas. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States." The script was gone, thrown out by the sheer force of the event. What America saw wasn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough. The mask of the impartial observer had slipped, and what was left was the face of a grieving nation, reflected in the eyes of the man it trusted most. The announcement of Kennedy's death wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a whole new way Americans would experience national tragedies. Right after Cronkite's emotional announcement, TV as people knew it just stopped. For the next 4 days, CBS, NBC, and ABC suspended all regular shows and, incredibly, all commercials. It was an unprecedented move that turned the television from a box of entertainment into the nation's central gathering place. This was the first time a major national crisis was covered with non-stop, wall-to-wall broadcasting. The numbers were mind-boggling. Somewhere between 93 and 96% of all American homes with a TV were tuned in, watching for an average of over 31 hours during those 4 days. The television became what some have called the new national hearth, a place where a shocked and grieving country could come together, even while they were alone in their homes, to try and make sense of it all. Before this, newspapers and radio were king. The Kennedy assassination cemented television's role as the primary source for live, immediate news, and Walter Cronkite was at the center of it all. After his own genuine show of grief, he continued to guide the nation through the confusing days that followed. His desk became home base for a massive news operation that was pretty much inventing the rules as it went. Cronkite anchored the coverage of the search for a suspect, the capture of Lee Harvey Oswald, and then, in another shocking television first, the live broadcast of Oswald being murdered by Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas police station. Millions of Americans watched a man get killed as it happened, another unbelievable tear in the fabric of reality, broadcast right into their living rooms. Through it all, Cronkite was the steady hand. That moment of emotion hadn't weakened his authority, it had strengthened it. By showing that he was hurting too, he validated the feelings of every single person watching. He gave the country permission to grieve. He anchored the coverage of Kennedy's casket arriving in Washington and the heartbreaking state funeral. He became the narrator of the nation's sorrow. It was a national tragedy that became a national, televised wake, and Walter Cronkite was its unwilling, but deeply humane, master of ceremonies. That moment on November 22, 1963, showed how a single broadcast could unite millions in a shared experience. Of course, the way we get our news today has changed a lot, but the power of a real, compelling story hasn't. If you find these dives into history meaningful, think about subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. We also want to hear from you. In the comments below, share a moment in broadcast history that has stuck with you. What was it, and why did it have such an impact? Walter Cronkite's brief, unscripted show of emotion was more than just a famous TV moment. It was a turning point for journalism and for the relationship between the media and the public. Before that day, the ideal news anchor was a detached authority figure, an emotionless reader of facts. Cronkite himself believed in that ideal. But in the face of a national trauma, that model just wasn't enough. His cracked voice and watery eyes didn't signal a failure of professionalism, they signaled the birth of a new kind of authenticity. It's fascinating to compare it to another famous moment in his career. 5 years later, in 1968, after a reporting trip to Vietnam, Cronkite would again step outside the lines. In a rare on-air editorial, he calmly and deliberately concluded that the war was mired in stalemate. That calculated, analytical statement is credited with shifting public opinion and even influencing President Lyndon B. Johnson's decision not to run for re-election. It was a moment of incredible political power, but the JFK announcement was different. It wasn't a calculated editorial, it was an involuntary reflex of the heart. The Vietnam report was the action of a powerful journalist, the Kennedy Bulletin was the reaction of a devastated citizen. And in many ways, it was the JFK moment that had a more lasting impact on broadcasting itself. It humanized the news anchor, changing the role from a simple reader of headlines into a national guide who could share in the public sorrow. The legacy of that moment is the understanding that in times of crisis, people don't just want facts, they want connection and reassurance. Cronkite's reaction became a symbol of a nation's grief precisely because it wasn't in the script. It was real. It proved that sometimes the most powerful thing a journalist has isn't objectivity, but humanity. The tear he fought back was a reflection of the tears of an entire nation, and by sharing that moment of vulnerability, Walter Cronkite cemented his place not just in the history of journalism, but in the heart of America.